Hi everyone, I'm Mark Wasilliou. I'm the MLA for Fort Garry, and welcome to our 6th episode on the Ledge podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to all things provincial politics. Now, the Manitoba Legislature just finished its major spring session. That's where the government passes most of its bills that it will this year, including the budget. We now go into a 4-month break where the Ledge isn't sitting. But before the House rose, lots of drama and toxicity at the Ledge, including Kinew's Hyper-partisan dealing with Canada unity and Manitoba Internal Free Trade Bill, Bill 47 tobacco. We'll talk about that. And then speaking of hyper-partisan politics, Kinew did a major policy flip-flop, coming out to being pro-oil and gas pipeline to Churchill after years of saying there would be no oil pipelines on his watch. And we'll be getting into the politics and the hypocrisy of that issue. I certainly have been hearing from many former New Democrats who feel betrayed on Kinew's flip-flop, and we'll talk more. And my riding of Fort Garry borders the University of Manitoba. I've had lots of students in my riding, including many international students. I met with them recently. We got into the issues that not only affect them, but affect all Manitobans, and it's an important discussion. Finally, I want to give listeners of the pod an update on the Southwood homeless encampment in Fort Garry. This is finally a good news story, and so I got some new information to share. So lots to cover. Let's get into it. It's very hard to pass legislation at the Manitoba Legislature. Most MLAs, especially those who are not cabinet members, go their entire career without passing anything substantial. And even if you are a cabinet minister, you're passing legislation that's being pushed by your ministry or is a priority of the Premier's office. Very rare for individual MLAs who have ideas for changes to the law to actually get them passed. In fact, most opposition or government MLAs only hope to pass what we call recognition bills. That's like making May the Ukrainian Heritage Week or Month bill. Oftentimes, opposition use their bill times to bring forward wedge legislation. Now, what that is, that these are issues that are uncomfortable or embarrassing to the government, and they don't want to be seen to be voting them down. So as opposition, what do? You bring it forward, force a vote, and force the government to choose what they're going to do. Now, often these legislation is not serious attempts at passing bills, but more to give the government a black eye. Now, one would think that a principal job as an MLA is to bring forward legislation and to convince your colleagues that it's a good idea and to pass it. But both major parties control what comes to the floor, and many backbencher bills don't ever see the light of day. When I was on government benches, I drafted 5 bills before leaving caucus. The Premier had ultimate control over whether any of them would ever see the light of day. Suffice to say, none of them ever got to the floor of the House. Now, the Premier wants to bring in their agenda, and they're not interested in other ideas or voices in the chamber. And we are all less for it. All members have good ideas. Many ideas are nonpartisan or strictly ideological, and given the chance, would garner support from all parts of the House. Now, toxic partisanship is such that you don't want to, and I'm quoting here because they say this often here, give them a win. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard it. And basically the idea is you can't give your political opponent any chance of success. Why? That's never explained, and it's taken to be self-evident. Even though everyone in the chamber is duly elected and has a right to be there, Manitobans would expect that we would be sitting around passing the laws, and that's just not what's occurring. In fact, if it isn't sanctioned by the Premier, it won't become law. So in a word, silly, it diminishes the role of an MLA in a way that Manitobans would be shocked to learn, and it hurts our politics. There is a need for recognition by the government and its refusal to let someone other than government get the win. It means that Manitoba is deprived of vital changes in our laws. Now, there's a pattern emerging at the Ledge where the government will tank opposition legislation that they even agree with and support just so the opposition doesn't get the win. Here are a couple examples. We recently had a bill come to the floor about mandatory breast cancer screening. Manitoba only has mandatory screening for breast cancer from age 50 onward. That's higher than almost every other province in Canada. Many women in their 40s get breast cancer, and this rule prevents early detection. The earlier you detect and treat cancer, the higher rates of survival and the actual less expensive it is to treat. If you get it too late, not only is there lower survival rates, it becomes more expensive to treat in the process. province. It makes sense to join the rest of the country and lower screening age from 50 to 40. Kathleen Cook, an MLA for Roblin and PC health critic, listening to community activists, including one from Fort Garry, forwards a bill that would require, in law, for the Minister of Health to develop and implement a plan to lower the age of eligibility for breast cancer screening, and the bill would require a report to the legislature as to the progress of that plan. This is a bill that absolutely nobody is opposed to. The NDP previously announced that they would administratively lower the age from 50 to 40 by 2026. They agreed. What they wouldn't do is put it in the law and wouldn't allow for regular annual reports to chart their progress. So if you get that, they agree with the substance of the bill, but they don't want any accountability, and they don't actually, if they don't keep their promise, they don't want people to know about it. So if the government isn't constrained by law, they can just go back on their promise. They can not bring in breast cancer testing for women at the age of 40, or they can structure it where very few can actually access it and nobody would be the wiser. Despite everyone agreeing with the substance of the bill, it died on the order paper, and the Kinew government prevented the PCs from, you guessed it, getting the win. The real loser here is Manitoba women. The next sort of example I want to give you is called Kira's Law. Now, shortly after Cindy Lamoureux, the independent MLA for Tyndall Park, introduced a bill known as Kira's Law. What this bill would do, it would require provincial judges to participate in continuing education about sexual assault law, intimate partner violence, coercive control in domestic relationships, and systemic racism and discrimination. This law was not on the Kinew government radar. They weren't interested in this issue until Lamoureux tabled her bill, and the NDP voted for the bill on second reading. It passed to committee stage without any amendments, and all that had to happen was for the bill to be called to have a committee process, and then it gets called for third reading. Remember, the Kinew government controls what bills come up for votes and what bills go to committee. The fate of this bill was in Wab Kinew's hands. They claimed to support it. They even voted for it on second reading. Then this happened. Lamoureux had to get the bill to third reading by November 7th deadline date, and requested that occur, and the Kinew government denied her request, killing any chance it would become law. The Kinew government brings in almost identical piece of legislation and makes it clear that they're only interested in passing their law. So it ends up both bills die on the order paper. And then only recently in this session did the Kinew government reinstate the bill and passed it. But why go through all that delay and effort? Well, they didn't want to give the Liberals the win. It's simple, and it's that petty. The bill was delayed by 8 unnecessary months because the government did not want to give the Manitoba Liberals a win in the chamber and to show that they were effective. So there was another bill that MLA Lamoureux brought, and again, similar sort of gamesmanship occurred. She brought in a piece of legislation that would mandate universal screening for learning disabilities. Again, this is preventative legislation. It would order that all school boards are required to have mandatory screening programs for their students for learning disabilities. The idea is you catch the issues early, you can address them sooner, and have a greater chance of mitigating whatever issues that child is facing. The end result is more children will succeed in our education system and less children will fall through the cracks. Again, who could be against this? This is smart, good policy. Everyone can get behind it. So then this happens. Emily Lamoureux's bill comes to debate and a vote on second reading, and it passes with the full support of the government. And again, instead of holding committee hearings and allowing it to go to third reading and become law, the government announces that they'll introduce universal early screening tools for students. No bill, it's just ministerial direction telling school boards to do it, meaning it has no force of law. It has no consequence if you don't actually follow the government's direction. No money is attached to it. That means school boards will have to pay for these screening assessments without any new resources to do it. Then the government refused to send the Lamoureux bill to committee and therefore stalled it, and it most likely, unless something changes, will die on the order paper. So, in summary, the NDP say they agree with the bill, They vote for the bill, and then they sabotage it and make sure that it doesn't become a law. They then bring in a weaker policy directive that has no force of law, no money attached to it, that requires school boards to pay for these assessments with very little resources because they're still being underfunded by the Kinew government. And they can ignore it, and there's no consequence to them, and it's not law in Manitoba. So if you believe in this law, then you think you would vote for it, then why would you act this way? And again, toxic hyper-partisan culture of the Ledge is that the government will do everything they can to make sure that the Manitoba Liberals don't get credit for doing their job, for doing what everybody expects MLAs to be doing. Final example I want to get is the free trade debate, because that's been something else to watch here. The most glaring example of hypocrisy in hyper-partisan politics, recent debate over provincial free trade bill. Nova Scotia had led the way. They brought in a bill that would automatically trigger a response from their province. If you remove trade barriers against Nova Scotia, then Nova Scotia automatically removes trade barriers against you. Kinew said he is in favor of interprovincial trade barrier removal. And in fairness, the previous PC government of Brian Pallister, one of his priorities was to remove trade barriers when nobody was talking about it, when it was not national headlines and nobody was panicking about Donald Trump. So it's very easy for Manitoba to talk about free trade because in practice, we are one of the provinces that has the fewest barriers up at all. So we actually have to move very little compared to what other provinces have to do. But to put this another way, other provinces are better at protecting their small businesses than Manitoba. And we've been all too comfortable having big out-of-province companies come into Manitoba and perform work that Manitobans could be doing and providing work for Manitoba small businesses that they could be providing. Now, Manitoba has had a real poor track record for local economic development and for standing up for our small business. But leaving that aside, the current mood is we got to get rid of these barriers. To that end, the PCs liked what Nova Scotia was doing, and they copied their bill. The Premier then tells the Media in Ontario press conference that he supports a Manitoba free trade bill. Despite that, when the PC free trade bill comes to a vote, the NDP is the only party in the House to vote against it. Both independents and the PCs vote for the bill, and it would have passed unanimously. And they don't give a reason why they claim to want this bill and then vote against it. And sure enough, as is their nature, a week later, the Manitoba NDP tables their own bill, which is substantially similar to the PC bill. Which begs the question, why didn't they just vote for the PC bill to begin with? And the answer, of course, is petty partisan politics. Well, the PCs dug in their heels, and they were not going to allow the passage of this bill before the end of session. The government bullied and threatened and said that they were going to extend the legislative sitting into June and basically trying to force the opposition to act. The opposition ended up negotiating a resolution for this, and this bill is now law in Manitoba. But instead of coming to bring people together, instead of negotiating with everybody in the House and finding a resolution, because apparently everybody supports this bill, this government basically retreated to hyper-partisanship and added to the toxic and dysfunctional nature of the legislature. And Manitobans do not benefit from this gamesmanship. It is more about personal agendas and politicians trying to get one over on their opponents than it is serving the people of Manitoba. And again, the big losers in all this are the Manitoba people. A major political movement happened in provincial politics recently, and it went without any significant media commentary. Wab Kinew has flip-flopped and reversed over 10 years of NDP policy about pipelines to Churchill here in Manitoba. It's one of those zombie ideas that never dies. And recently, Daniel Smith, the premier from Alberta, the Conservative premier, has a dream of getting Alberta oil and gas to the Port of Churchill in Hudson Bay. Now, this idea is not new. It goes back decades. There's been no serious proposal with money behind it ever put forward. And that being said, Conservative politicians love to talk about it and love this idea. And it appears now that Wab Kinew has jumped on the bandwagon. Now, the port has historically been used to ship grain from Western Canada to the world. The main customer was the Canadian Wheat Board, which was headquartered in Winnipeg. And in 2012, Stephen Harper privatized the wheat board and ended its monopoly. And with that, that ended the shipping of grain through the port of Churchill. And that was the reason the port collapsed. Now, the railway to Churchill at the time was privatized, and it was owned by a U.S. company that had been sort of the main customer for moving the grain. And all of a sudden, their business model collapsed. So they began to champion transportation of Alberta tar sands oil through the port because they needed something to go through there. Now, this area is covered by permafrost, muskeg, pristine wilderness. The rail bed heaves and sinks. Heavy equipment sinks into the muskeg. Now, a train from the Paw to Churchill takes 40 hours to get there. You can't drive fast. The reason why, the rails will heat up and it melts the permafrost and it causes derailments. And of course, train derailments are super common on this railway. And of course, the area is environmentally sensitive. If there's a spill, help's not coming, at least anytime soon. Now, you also are crossing Indigenous sovereign territory, and every time this idea comes up, no one has consulted or basically asked First Nations to get on board or what they even think. And the other problem is Churchill Port isn't big enough for tankers to turn around. And so the economy is heavily reliant in Churchill for ecotourism, and a spill would be devastating to that effect. Now, if that wasn't all bad enough, the Port of Churchill can't run all year long because Hudson Bay freezes solid with ice. Now, more and more days of open ice are occurring because of climate change. And over the past 30 years, there is now 30 more days of open ice than there was 30 years ago. But even with that, the majority of the year, that passage is going to be frozen shut. And so it makes it very hard to make a business case to actually use it as a reliable shipping lane. Now, in 2013, when the U.S.-based railway company was seeking to do this, the then NDP government shut that idea down. They basically said the possible environmental effects of a spill were too severe, and they weren't going to take that chance. So Omnitrax, the U.S. company, stopped operating the railway. They couldn't make it economically viable. There was damage to the railway, and they basically just gave up on it. And a group of First Nations purchased the railway and have been operating it ever since. But there is still no infrastructure to deal with an oil spill in Arctic waters. It would cost billions of dollars to put it in. And of course, the world is getting off oil and gas. And the market that they're looking for this is Europe. And they're leading the world with trying to get off of carbon fuels. So the business case has never been made out by proponents. Fast forward to 2020, in February, a Saskatchewan premier again revived this zombie idea of shipping oil through the Port of Churchill. Then Premier Brian Ballister said he was open to the idea. Now, Wab Kinew is the leader of the Manitoba NDP, and the Manitoba NDP releases a statement that day from its environment critic, speaking on behalf of the entire Manitoba NDP, and I'll quote, "We oppose building a pipeline to Churchill that would put the community, the environment, and our vulnerable polar bear species at risk." The critic went on to say, "We're proud to stand with the community who have already rejected this project." So, pretty clear statement. Manitoba NDP was opposed to a gas pipeline in Churchill. And of course, there has never been a serious plan or private money on the table in any event. Again, this is a zombie idea. Now, Heather Stephenson then became Premier of Manitoba after Brian Ballister, and a new group comes forward with the backing of First Nations called the Nistanan Project. They want to ship potash and petroleum products through Hudson Bay. This is a Calgary-based corporation. None of these projects ever seem to come from Manitoba, let alone Northern First Nations. So their vision would be that this energy corridor would be 100% Indigenous owned. They want to build a brand new port south of Churchill at the mouth of Nelson River. Now, this site was originally abandoned in the 1930s by the federal government because it was too silty for a port, and that's why they've actually built the port where it is in Churchill. But Heather Stephenson's PCs pledged $6.7 million to fund part of a $26 million feasibility study to see if this was even possible. Again, no local First Nation or Northern community is part of this or was asking for it, and that announcement was made on August 3rd, 2023. 2 months later, Stephenson government falls. Now Wab Kinew is the premier of the province, and one of the first things his government did was to cancel the $6.7 million pledge to fund a second study to port on Hudson Bay. Manitoba now doesn't help fund a study to open up another energy corridor and port to Hudson Bay. Now, what's also interesting, when you talk to NDP candidates from the 2023 election, they tell you a story where they were taken on a tour of the election headquarters by Wab Kinew. And Wab spoke to these potential MLAs, some of them who are now sitting MLAs, and he made it clear that being an NDP MLA candidate, you were required to believe in some things that were non-negotiable. Now, the obvious ones, like a Manitoba NDP MLA has to be pro-choice. And this is critical for this discussion, you also had to be against new oil pipelines. So Wab Kinew made it a condition of being an NDP MLA that you had to oppose new pipelines. So that's the fall of 2023. And that's what Wab Kinew believed. Now, what happens? He's now in government, he's now the premier, and Donald Trump is elected. And on February 5th, 2025, according to CBC, they asked him if he would ship oil through Hudson Bay. And in the words of CBC, Kinew brushed the idea off. Then we have February 9th, 2025. Kinew meets with a delegation from the EU that are looking for hydrogen to be shipped to Europe. And 4 days later, he softens his position and he begins to talk about the idea. What's interesting is First Nations then issue a press release saying, don't forget about us, that we weren't even consulted on this. So much for reconciliation. Then something dramatic changes. On May 26, 2025, Wab Kinew appears on Power and Politics national CBC politics show, and he does a dramatic flip-flop in his position. He's now concerned about Danielle Smith and the Premier of Alberta and getting her tar sands oil to Northern Tidewater, and he basically comes out now in favor of this. His party members have not been consulted on this. I doubt any First Nations have been consulted on this. Wab Kinew has unilaterally changed over a decade of policy for the Manitoba NDP, and I bet you if you talk to the caucus or cabinet, there's been no discussions. So he went from an environmentally conscious party where he listened to northern communities and respected Indigenous sovereignty to one that would basically impose his will come hell or high water, and I guess in this case, Northern Tidewater. Now, the bottom line is that Wab Kinew cannot be trusted on the environment, and he has had some crazy, wild flip-flops. So it's not just this. He's also said that he was pro-carbon tax at one point and was planning to bring in a made in Manitoba carbon tax, even if the federal government got rid of theirs. He also said that he would legislate greenhouse emission targets. He now seems to be opposed to that. He also said he would convert 5,000 homes to geothermal in 4 years, and we're 2 years in and no money has been spent and no homes have been converted. So a lot of NDP voters right now don't recognize this party. And what we've seen tragically in Manitoba is the wildfire season, which is directly related to climate change, where we've seen over 18,000 Manitobans having to flee their home. We've seen several people lose their lives. There has been homes and properties that have been destroyed. Whole communities are being threatened right now. The price tag to mitigate the loss from this will be in the hundreds of millions of dollars and potentially could be worse. And at the same time this is happening to Manitoba, our premier is unilaterally changing the policy of the Manitoba NDP without consulting anybody and saying that we're now a pro-pipeline party. And this is all to pander to Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, somebody that can't even vote for Wab Kinew. So there you have it. A once party dedicated to mature and responsible environmental stewardship is now shilling for U.S.-based oil companies in the tar sands. Today, I want to talk a little bit about international students. This is a huge issue in Fort Garry. My riding borders on the University of Manitoba. I have a huge student population living in my riding, including many international students. But I want to give you some background to Manitoba politics and international students. In the past few years, there has been an explosion in the international student population in Manitoba. Now, for those that don't know, international students pay up to 3 times the tuition that a Canadian student would pay to attend and go to the exact same programs and institutions in Manitoba. And the province of Manitoba has for years been underfunding post-secondary education. And as a strategy to survive, these institutions have been taking on more and more international students because they can charge them more, and that makes up for the funding shortfall that they're getting from the province. Now, the province has benefited from this, what's arguably an exploitative relationship for years. So, for one, they can continue underfunding post-secondary institutions, and they sort of delay the chickens coming home to roost until now, and I'll get into that in a minute. But it's also the second and most important reason for international students. It's one of the main drivers for immigration into the province. Many of these students come here for school, but they're on a path for Canadian citizenship. They end up staying, getting jobs, and end up living their lives here as Manitobans. So the province, under the Pallister government, cut funding for international student health care. Manitoba used to pay for it, and if you're a student, you just would show up at any medical facilities and you could be treated free of charge, just like any other Manitoba. But the Pallister government cut this, and it wasn't actually a lot of money. In opposition, we were told it was about $3 million a year, and on a $25 billion budget, that's really barely noticeable. But now, Manitoba has the dubious distinction of being one of only 2 provinces in Canada that make international students get privatized health insurance coverage. And this causes a number of problems. To begin with, it means that it's more expensive to come to school in Manitoba than almost every other province. Not only do you have to pay to come here, but now you have to pay for healthcare, where if you go to school in Saskatchewan, Ontario, you do not have to pay for private healthcare insurance. So what does that mean? It means that we're losing out on the best and brightest students. Some of them are choosing to go to other jurisdictions because, quite frankly, it's cheaper and they get healthcare coverage. But this is a key driver of our immigration strategy, is to recruit international students so that they stay here, and we actually subsidize, even though they pay 3 times the tuition, their education. So it's self-defeating. If they leave, we're not going to get our full money's worth and convert these students into tax-paying skilled workers for the province. The second problem with this is that the money isn't huge. It's $3 million. This is nothing. And the other aspect to it, and it's just like when we hear stories about private healthcare in the United States, many students simply won't get insured. They skip it. And even when their health is compromised, they won't pay for expensive medication or go see a doctor because, just like in the United States, what will happen is when they show up to a medical clinic here in Manitoba, often the medical clinics want payment up front and they'll bill Blue Cross later for the coverage. Well, if you're a student and you're struggling, you may not have $1,200 to pay up front for medical coverage. And so what ends up happening is the students just don't go. They won't, even if they do have private insurance, they won't use it and they won't get their health checked out. So the same problems as in the U.S. we're seeing with international students. The Manitoba NDP has long said that they were against this practice, have long promised that they were going to reinstitute healthcare coverage for international students. But halfway through their mandate, they simply haven't done it. And they're still saying they're going to do it. But given how little money it actually takes to cover these students, it's actually surprisingly disappointing that they haven't done so yet. So I recently met with a group of international students at the University of Manitoba. And of course, this was one of their major concerns. And this affects thousands and thousands of students that live here. But the other concern that they raised with me that we often don't think about is student housing for international students. They often are the victims of scams. They arrange for housing in their home country, they pay a deposit, they land in Manitoba, and all of a sudden their landlord isn't answering the phone. There isn't actually a spot that they've put a deposit on, and they've basically been defrauded out of their deposit. Now, the other issue that happens to international students that we as Canadians take for granted is that they don't have a credit history in Canada. So reputable landlords, the places that you actually want to stay in, they want people to have an established credit history in deciding who to rent to. And if you come from a foreign country, you're not going to have that. And the alternative is to have someone be your guarantor. That's somebody who will sort of vouch for you legally, sign the lease, and if you can't pay, then the landlord can sue them and get them to pay on the student's behalf. But if you're from elsewhere and you're here as a student, you don't have relatives, you don't have friends, you don't have family here, you're coming here with nothing, you don't have anybody to guarantee your rent. So this has real consequences. It means that international students can't get housing through normal, reputable rental companies here in Manitoba, and they get pushed into a gray market. And these are like makeshift rooming houses in University Heights neighborhood of Fort Garry or in the Fort Richmond neighborhood. And you've heard the horror stories about basements in these communities with 8 students being housed in tiny little pods or cubicles in the basement. Often there's no leases that they've signed. They can be evicted at a moment's notice. They're often required to pay damage deposits. And then when they leave, the landlords don't ever give them back. And of course, we have laws in Manitoba that would protect people from this type of behavior. But imagine putting yourself in the position of an international student. You're new. You're unfamiliar with the culture in your own country. You've had bad experiences with the courts, the police, and government, and you're scared and you're unsure how to access help. And so many international students who are facing this kind of problems don't advocate for themselves, they don't come forward, and they don't seek out legal remedies, and they get exploited as a result. So what can we do about all this? Well, Ontario wanted to clamp down on international students being preyed upon and exploited, so they made it a directive that if you're a post-secondary institution, you accept international students, you now have to guarantee their housing. And that puts the onus on these institutions to look after the students that they're recruiting. Now, that's not a bad idea, and Manitoba could adopt it, but here's the problem. In Ontario, they didn't provide any funding for post-secondary institutions to expand housing options for international students. And we have a housing crisis in Manitoba. We can't house people who are Canadians and Manitobans living here. And with the massive influx of international students, that's putting an even greater strain on the rental market. So if we go down this route, the province has to build housing that international students can access. And, especially if we're going to force these students coming here to pay 3 times the tuition fees that Canadians pay, we have a moral duty to at least provide them functional healthcare system and proper housing. So we can not only guarantee housing, but we can build and provide more housing for these students. We can also fund residential tenancies advocates, people who specialize in residential tenancies law, who can work with these students, ensure that they're not exploited, that they know their rights when they're in Manitoba, and help them navigate their legal system. So these could be paid positions at post-secondary legal aid clinics that work with international students. So again, we want them to come. We count on them for immigration. These are our skilled workers for the future, and we are spending a lot of money as taxpayers to make this happen. And now it's on us to make sure that they're welcomed here and they're treated fairly. I wanted to give listeners to the pod a quick update on the Southwood Encampment. For those that don't know, I have a homeless encampment in the south part of my riding, and it's been in existence for the past 6 years in the University Heights neighborhood. And recently, things had actually gotten worse there. The encampment was not just seasonal like many of them are. It was becoming a year-round encampment, and it was starting to grow. And when people who are experiencing homelessness were pushed out of sleeping in transit shelters by the Kinew government, they ended up migrating into encampments. And so we don't have people sleeping in transit shelters anymore, but we've seen an explosion here in Winnipeg with these encampments, and Southwood was no different. I was getting calls from constituents. They were very concerned. There was homes right across the street, 75 feet away from the encampment, and there was fires, constant fires there, and fire crews being there. And this is a wooded area. And of course, there's concerns in a dry season like this about it being lit up. And there was some obvious tension between those living in the encampment and the neighboring community. So used needles everywhere, trash, abandoned shopping carts, mounds of debris. The community saw an uptick in vandalism, petty crime. Police, all of a sudden, who had no reason to be in the community, was often there. And of course, you had these out of control fires. So the community got together and wanted to see this resolved. And I really want to thank them for their advocacy. We were able to get the province to take notice, and that was by no means a small feat. And I want to happy to report that by the end of May 2025, Southwood Encampment had been dismantled. The area had been cleaned up. The people living in the encampment finally got the resources and the supports that they needed. And we're talking about 6 years now. And that was because of the neighborhood. And the community worked together, and they basically took a tense situation and they were able to resolve it in a really great way. And I think it actually is a model for what other neighborhoods can do. And the community and my office, we advocated the province and the city to take responsibility, and it worked. You don't hear these stories enough, and you don't hear the successes enough. And people are just cynical, saying, well, you can't sort of fight City Hall. You can't get the province to do anything. But, the Southwood Encampment very much tells you that you can. The province claimed that they didn't have the housing transition people out of encampments. And I think most people would accept that this takes some time. But if the province is the one causing delay, and they have a moral obligation to mitigate problems associated with encampments and to reduce the tension between those living in encampments and their neighbors. And that means paying for and providing regular services to encampment dwellers, including regular garbage removal, needle drop boxes, and portable water and access to porta potties. These are simple services. They go a long way to keep everyone safe, to allow everyone to live in dignity and make sure that these fires aren't set or out of control. So it's literally the least the province can do. Encampment residents are residents of the city of Winnipeg and the province, and they deserve services like anyone else. And the tensions arise and the conflict happens between these communities because there isn't the supports in place to mitigate the problems. This is very much a fixable problem. So I want to thank the good people of University Heights. I want to thank those who advocated and were concerned about their community and got this done. Thank you and well done. Well, thank you for joining us once again for the 6th edition of the Ledge podcast. We'd love to hear from you. We're on all social media channels. You can reach me by email at mark@markwasiliumla.ca. And we love getting emails from listeners, especially recently about the pipeline issue. So please send. We'd love to hear.